Next, from Springfield, we talk to Peter Schoenke, chairman of the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, about the business of fantasy sports and legislation that considers fantasy sports gambling as opposed to a game of skill, thus negatively impacting the industry. This runs about 10 minutes.
Peter Schoenke, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. One of the issues that is being considered here in the state capitol today is the whole issue of online betting and fantasy sports. There's a lot of people who are very familiar with this, and there's a lot of people who aren't. First of all, why don't we just start before we get to the legislation? Tell us about this industry, how long has it been around, and just what is it?
Well, fantasy sports have been around in Illinois as a commercial business for over 20 years, and there have been paid contests where you can play and win money for over 20 years. And so, recently there's been a lot of advertising and growth in daily fantasy sports. DraftKings and FanDuel are the companies, but it's a much larger industry than just that.
So, I know some of the younger people have fantasy sports teams. They pick their players. How does one participate in this? And I don't mean technologically, but I mean, what's the purpose of it? Instead of having like rooting for the Cardinals or the Cubs or whatever football team you follow, you actually put together your own team. Isn't that how it works?
Right. So the best way I would describe it is that it's a way for you to be a GM, right? My dream job is not to actually play center field for the Cubs. It's to be Theo Epstein and be the GM and pick the players. That is fun, and that's what fantasy sports kind of simulates. It's the ability to pick a roster and pick players, and I saw that guy play one time. He's going to be a star. I'm going to have him on my team, and my team is going to be better than your team. And it's a competition among other individuals, and that's kind of the genesis of it all. And over the years, there's the variety of ways to play. You can play head-to-head, and then daily fantasy is just the new evolution for that. You can play for a shorter duration instead of a whole season. You can play one day in baseball or 1 week in football.
So how many companies are there within the industry that are making a business out of it?
So the Fantasy Sports Trade Association has over 300 members. There's over 120 game operators. And it includes major media companies like ESPN and CBS, and also some smaller startups. The National Fantasy Baseball Championship, which is his parent company is headquartered in Chicago. So there's a lot. It's a wide variety of small and large businesses.
So, two of the names that we've seen advertised, although now I'm not sure if they're allowed to advertise or where that stands. One was FanDuel, and the other is what?
DraftKings. So daily fantasy sports has evolved in the last 2 or 3 years and really became a big part of the industry the last 2 years. FanDuel and DraftKings raised a lot of capital, a lot of venture money, and they had a successful product, and so they advertised it. There was a lot of advertising, and unfortunately, that's brought a lot of scrutiny on our industry from people that don't really understand fantasy sports. They think it's gambling, and that's caused some states for the legality of fantasy sports, which was always assumed to be a game of skill, and I argue would be. It's been called into question, and that's what's happened here in Illinois. So well,
let's then get into, is it gambling? Or you're saying it's not gambling; it's a game of skill.
Yes,
And before we dissect that point, how does one make money in this process?
There are entry fees, and you can win a tournament, no different than like a bowling tournament, right, or a golf tournament. You go down to your local bowling alley. You pay some money. You compete in the tournament. The top guy wins a prize, right? And so very similar for fantasy sports. You enter a contest. There's an entry fee, and you can win a prize if you're the top competitor. And that's how it works.
So everyone, I'm just making these numbers up. Everyone who participates might say $10 to enter.
There's a variety of different ways you can play. So the most common way to play is you and your friends sign up on a league on ESPN or Yahoo, and on the side, you have a pool of money, and whoever is the winner wins that money. But then there are also commercial enterprises that allow you to play. So you don't have 10 friends to join a league. You can go online and play. So you put in $10, and then the top prize is like $80, and at the end of the season you win. And daily fantasy sports is another iteration of that, where it's just one day as opposed to the whole season.
Now, am I correct that a lot of friends will form their own pool and just kind of do this on their own?
Yes, that's definitely true.
So what's the role of and I want to get to the legislation here in Illinois, but for those who are totally unfamiliar, as I am largely, with this. I wanted to kind of lay the foundation. So we get to the point, so now people said, hey, instead of it just being kind of piecemeal and friends doing this from college or something and going together, so I may not have other people to want to go in and do it with me, but I can therefore join and go through these organizations that you represent.
Right, or you might say, wow, I'm playing with my friends, but my friends aren't really good competition. I think I'm really good at this. I'm going to go compete against the best players in the country. So you could join a contest like the National Fantasy Baseball Championship, where and you can win a lot of money. You go against a lot of really smart people who take it seriously, and that's fun competition. No different than like golf. You might play golf at your country club or your local golf course, but there are some people who say, well, I want better competition. I'm going to go enter the qualifier for the U.S. Open, or I'm going to try and make the PGA Tour. Very similar.
Yeah, and it increases, I would say, the interest in the sport. If we look at the Cubs that everyone knows have gone, over a century, have gone 70 years without winning a pennant. But you could have picked over the years someone like an Ernie Banks or Ron Santo on your fantasy team and been excited about what they were doing as individuals, right, along with other people that were on your team who might actually be playing for Pittsburgh or the Cardinals or something else.
Right, since it takes a lot of skill, you really have to research all the players on all the teams. So you need to know the fourth wide receiver for some team that's not in your state that you don't follow, or the backup catcher, the fifth starter. It makes you a better fan, we like to say, because you have to know all the teams, and that drives consumption of media and also of the sport. You're interested in a game. If you live in Chicago, there's an American League game that doesn't involve the White Sox, and you're watching it closely. And so the leagues love that. It causes people to watch more games, to watch them more intently, and so that's why the leagues are behind fantasy and daily fantasy sports.
Okay. Now you're here in the state capitol because you're wanting what from the legislature?
So there was an attorney general opinion that fantasy sports is gambling. And so, while it's just an opinion, and she's not, going after any company, that's led to some uncertainty for our industry to be able to operate in Illinois. So we're seeking legislation that will clarify it's legal, and also add consumer protection measures that the industry has advocated, and then also have, if there's any fees, have a structure that works for smaller companies, in addition to just the DraftKings and FanDuels, which have grown very large.
And I'll say for the viewers, there's a demonstration going on for higher education, so that's all the screaming in the background. So the Attorney General is saying this is gambling, and again, just your contention is because people pick the players on their fantasy team based upon the research they did. It's not an arbitrary game like a ball bouncing around on a roulette table. Right?
Yeah, exactly. There's no turn of the dice or turn of the card. You have to win, to even play fantasy. It takes a lot of work. You got to know all the players, the fourth wide receiver, the fifth pitcher, and so it takes a lot of work. And to win, it takes a lot of skill. The people who win these games put in a lot of time, and they just have innate abilities to pick the right players and have the right strategy. So it's very different than gambling, where you go to the casino and you put down some money and the dice are rolled, or the slots come up and you either win or you don't.
So the legislature would pass a bill that would clearly say this is legal to do? Is that what you want?
So it would remove the uncertainty that's come up in the state, clarify it's legal, and add a lot of consumer protection measures. And it's a bill that some of our members, it has some things that are difficult for them. It's gonna increase their cost of business, but overall, it achieves those goals and allows us to operate and flourish in the state.
It seems to me there are at least a couple of issues here. One would be, Illinois already allows gambling in any number of things. I mean, whether it's horse racing or playing the lottery, which truly is a game of chance. On the other hand, your issue that it's not gambling because it's based on skill of. Wouldn't that then say that horse racing is not gambling because I can pick the horse based on research, or that playing poker wouldn't be gambling because I'm good at cards? I mean,
so horse racing, they have different integrity. We're fantasy sports we don't feel it's gambling, but there's money involved. It just doesn't fit into the same slot that gambling does because it's different. And one of the reasons is, for example, with the horse racing, fantasy sports doesn't have the integrity issue that horse racing has. There's no house. You're going against other players. We don't run and organize the track so that we can manipulate the horses or the jockeys or something like that. We just take entry fees. It's a competition between two players, and it's about NFL games or other sport games that are being run that we have no control over. So those integrity issues are not there. And that's why Major League Baseball and the NFL and all the major sports leagues like Fantasy Sports endorse it, often operate their own games on their own websites, or haven't even invested in DraftKings and FanDuel. Those integrity issues are not there.
Not to keep you too long now, but what is in it for the state of Illinois? So, by the way, your association is headquartered, the National Association,
Yes.
right? It's headquartered in Chicago. Is there money that would come to the state? Where the state is obviously starving for revenue.
Right.
Would it mean anything financially to the state?
So, first of all, there are over 2 million people that play fantasy sports in Illinois. So without the passage of this bill, fantasy sports won't continue in the form that it has now. A lot of people are not going to be able to play an activity that they like. So that's one of the first things. As far as what it does for the state, there is a tax component. And I think that, while no industry likes to be taxed, I think that we're willing to go forward with that because it's a good bill overall, and the tax rates are fair and equitable, and they're going to allow our industry to continue. And it will add to the...
What is the rate that would be?
There's like a sliding scale up to...
And is it on the winnings, or how? Or is it how is it taxed?
It's on the earnings of the company, on the earnings of the companies.
A FanDuel or whatever.
Yeah, so the money that they're earning in Illinois from Illinois residents, but it's not going to add significant tax revenue. We're not that big an industry. We're a $4 or $5 billion industry. We're not like casinos. This is not a revenue generator that's going to solve the Illinois budget crisis by any means. But at the same time, it will contribute significant money to some money to the state, and that'll be a benefit for the state.
And you testified today before a House committee hearing. How did that go?
It moved on past that committee, and hopefully they'll keep moving and be voted on the floor at some point. But how and where the legislature works, I'm not the expert on that one. So.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.